Hey guys, before we begin tonight, if you're new here, consider tapping that subscribe button. It helps this channel grow, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from tonight. I always like seeing that. Alright, now, let's settle in. Go ahead and dim the lights if you haven't already. Get yourself comfortable, wherever that is tonight. A bed, a couch, somewhere soft. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we're going somewhere very old, older than memory, older than any story you were told as a child, older than the ground beneath the oldest cities on Earth. We're going back to the beginning of everything, not the beginning of a kingdom, or a war, or a single human life, but the beginning of the sky, the sea, the mountains, and the gods who would one day rule them all. Long before Greece had a name, before marble columns rose white against the horizon, before anyone carved a temple into a hillside and called it sacred, there was only a vast, formless quiet. Imagine, for a moment, standing at the edge of that quiet. No wind, because there is no air to move. No light, because there is nothing yet to shine. No sound, because sound needs a world to travel through, and this world does not exist yet. Just stillness. A stillness so complete it has no edges, the people who lived in the hills and valleys of ancient Greece, centuries and centuries ago, told each other stories about this stillness. Around low fires, in the hush after the sheep were settled and the day's work was done, someone would begin, and the world would take shape again, the way it always had, the way it always would. Tonight, I want to tell you that story the way they might have told it. Slowly. Patiently. Not as a list of names and battles to memorize, but as something closer to a memory, something you can sink into. Over the next several hours, we'll move together through the whole shape of it. We'll watch the first shadowy forces stir out of nothing at all. We'll see a great mother spread herself out and become the ground we still walk on. We'll meet titans, vast and strange, who ruled an age before anyone thought to call it golden until it was already gone. We'll follow a boy hidden away in a mountain cave, kept safe from a father who feared him more than anything else in the world. We'll watch that boy grow into someone who would tear the old order down and build something new in its place, brother by brother, throne by throne. We'll walk the quiet halls of a kingdom under the earth, and stand on a windswept peak where 12 new gods would eventually gather. We'll see fire given away as a gift, and watch what that gift costs the one who gave it. None of this will rush. That's not why we're here tonight. We're here to slow down, to let this ancient, sprawling story unfold at its own pace, the way smoke rises from a dying fire, in no hurry to go anywhere. You don't need to remember every name. You don't need to hold on to every thread. If your eyes grow heavy halfway through, if your mind starts to drift somewhere between the Titans and the first light of Olympus, that's all right. That's more than all right. That's what this is for, so let the room go quiet around you now. Let the voice be the only thing left. Somewhere, far back before the first sunrise, before the first breath of wind moved across a still and empty dark, something began to stir, and that is where our story starts. Somewhere in that endless stillness we spoke of a moment ago, something shifted, not a sound, not yet. More like a pressure. A change in the texture of nothing. The way the air feels different just before a storm arrives, even when the sky is still clear. The old poets who first tried to put this moment into words called it chaos, though not chaos the way we use the word now, not confusion or disorder. Back then, it meant something closer to a yawning gap. A vast, open chasm. A wide mouth of space with nothing inside it yet. Picture it like this: a cave so deep you cannot see the bottom, so wide you cannot find the walls. Except there is no cave, and no walls, and nothing to hold the shape at all. Just distance, stretching in every direction, waiting. This was the very first thing to exist. Before gods. Before earth. Before sky. Just this gap. This waiting room of the universe, dark and silent and utterly empty, except for its own vastness. It's strange to think about, isn't it, the idea that even nothingness had to come from somewhere. That before there could be a story, there first had to be a space large enough to hold one. The shepherds telling this tale around their fires understood that instinctively. They knew that every field needs open ground before a single seed can take root. Every house needs an empty plot before the first stone is laid. So too, they said, did the universe need chaos of a great, dark clearing before anything else could grow inside it, and slowly, so slowly that no single moment could be pointed to as the beginning, things did begin to grow. Out of that vast gap came a presence with no shape yet, no face, no voice. The old stories gave it a name anyway, because even the earliest storytellers needed something to hold onto. They called it Erebus, the deep, close darkness, the kind you feel pressing against your eyelids in a windowless room at midnight. And alongside it, quiet and patient, came NYX. Night herself, though not night as we know it now, with stars scattered across it like scattered grain. Just night in its purest, oldest form. Darkness without a single point of light to interrupt it, for a long while. That was all there was. Chaos, holding its silence. Erebus, deep and close. NYX, wide and waiting. Three presences. None of them able to see the others, none of them able to speak, drifting in a darkness with no beginning and no end. But even darkness, it turns out, cannot stay perfectly still forever. Something in NYX stirred, quietly, the way a seed stirs beneath frozen soil long before anyone above the ground can see a single green shoot. And from that stirring came two children, though nothing about their birth resembled anything we would call birth today. There was no cradle, no gentle hands, no first cry into open air. There was only darkness giving way to something new. Erebus and NYX, together, bringing forth ether, the bright upper air the gods themselves would one day breathe, and Hemera. The day, soft and pale, still unsure of her own light, for the first time, there was a difference between one moment and the next. Dark, and then not quite so dark. Night, and then something that was not night. It would be easy to imagine this happening quickly, dramatically, the way a match strikes and a room floods with light all at once. But it wasn't like that. It was slower than that. Gentler. Like the way morning arrives now, gradually, so gradually that you can never quite catch the exact instant when night becomes day. Chaos remained, underneath everything, holding it all. It didn't disappear once Erebus and NYX and their children arrived. It simply became the foundation, the deep well from which everything else would keep rising, and rising is exactly what came next, because somewhere in that widening space, something even larger than darkness was beginning to take shape. Something with a surface you could stand on. Something with weight and breadth and a kind of patient, waiting strength, something that would soon be called Gaia, but that is where we'll go next. Something was growing in the dark now, and unlike the quiet, drifting presences that came before, this one had weight, where Erebus and Nyx were more like moods than bodies, more like the feeling of a room than anything you could touch. This new presence was different. Solid. Broad. Patient in a way that felt almost physical. The old storytellers said she rose up out of chaos not as a spark of light or a whisper of shadow, but as ground itself. Earth, given form. Given breath. Given, in her own vast and quiet way, a kind of consciousness. They called her Gaia. Try to picture her not as a woman standing somewhere, but as the world stretching outward in every direction at once. And yet somehow still herself. Still aware. Still, in whatever way something so enormous can be, alive. Her shoulders were hillsides. Her hair, if you could call it that, spread out as forests before there was a single seed to grow one. Wherever she settled, ground appeared beneath her, patient and firm, ready to hold whatever might one day stand on it. For a long while, she simply was. Existing in that same vast dark that had held Chaos and Erebus and Nyx before her. But ground, by its very nature, seems to invite something to rest upon it. And so, quietly, without any grand announcement, Gaia began to shape the first rough features of a world. Picture valleys settling into place the way a sleeping animal settles into a familiar curve of ground. Picture mountains rising, not violently, but the way a slow breath lifts a chest, gradual, deliberate, unhurried. There was no sun yet to catch on their peaks. No rivers yet to carve their slopes. Just shape. Just form, taking its first tentative steps into being, and in that early quiet, alone amid all this new ground she had made, Gaia did something both very simple and very strange. She reached upward, not with a hand, because she had none yet in any way we would recognize, but with intention. With need. She wanted something to arch above her. Something to hold the space over her new, broad shoulders. Something to complete the shape of a world that so far only had a floor and no ceiling, and so, from herself, without any partner, without any spark from outside, she brought forth Uranus. The sky, think of it like a seed splitting open entirely on its own, with nothing to plant it but the pressure of its own readiness. That is how the old stories described it. No father, no distant hand guiding the moment. Just Gaia, vast and waiting, producing from her own depths a great dome to arch above her, blue in some tellings, though there was no true blue yet, no true anything, just the promise of a shape the world would need forever after. Uranus spread himself out above her the way a canopy spreads above a forest floor. Close enough to touch her at the edges, where the far horizons met, but distant enough at its highest point to hold whatever might someday hang there. Stars, not yet scattered. Clouds, not yet gathered. Just open space, waiting the way Gaia herself had once waited in the dark before chaos. Together, they made something the world had never had before, an above and a below. A place to stand, and a place to look up toward. It's a strange thing to imagine, isn't it, that even something as basic as looking upward had to be invented, had to be earned through this quiet, patient unfolding. The old tellers, sitting by their low fires long after the sheep had settled for the night, would often pause here. Let the moment breathe a little. Because what came next, they knew, would not stay quite so gentle. Gaia and Uranus, earth and sky, mother and the dome above her, came together in that stillness, and from their joining came children. vast children older and stranger than anything that would walk the world afterward. Children who would one day be called Titans, but those children, and the world they were born into, still had a great deal of shaping left to do, and that shaping would not always be peaceful. There is a certain kind of quiet that follows a great change, and that quiet settled over the young world once earth and sky had found each other. But it didn't last. From the union of Gaia and Uranus came children unlike anything that had existed before them. Not shadows, like Erebus and NYX. Not landscapes given breath, like Gaia herself. These were beings with form, with will, with hungers and thoughts of their own. 12 of them in all, 6 sons and 6 daughters, and the old tellers gave them a name that would echo through everything that followed. Titans. They were enormous, these first children. Not enormous the way a mountain is enormous, indifferent and unmoving, but enormous the way a storm is enormous. Full of restless, gathering force. Oceanus, eldest of them, took to the very edges of the world, becoming a great river that encircled everything Gaia had made, holding the young earth in a slow, endless embrace. Hyperion rose as something bright and burning, not yet the sun itself but close kin to it, a promise of light before light had truly learned how to shine. Rhea, gentler than her brothers, moved quietly among them, watching, waiting, though no one yet knew what she was waiting for. And then there was Cronus, the youngest of the sons, but somehow never the smallest in the way that mattered. Even in those early days, there was something coiled and watchful about him, something that made his siblings glance twice in his direction before returning to their work. For a time, the Titans simply lived. If you can call it living, this slow, sprawling existence of vast beings finding their place in a still-forming world. They pressed their hands into wet clay hills and left mountains behind. They breathed across open plains and called wind into being for the first time. Days had a shape now, and nights too, though the two blurred together often, since there was still no sun to mark the difference clearly. Beneath all this new movement, though, something else was stirring, something far less peaceful. Uranus, watching his children grow larger and bolder with each passing season, felt the first stirrings of something the world had never known before. Fear. Not fear of a storm, or a flood, or any danger that could be seen and measured. This was quieter, and far more dangerous. A father's fear of his own children. A fear that the ones he had made might, in time, be strong enough to unmake him. It's a strange thing, watching pride curdle slowly into dread. The old storytellers lingered here, letting their voices drop lower, because they knew this was the hinge on which everything else would turn. A father who loves what he has made will protect it. A father who fears what he has made becomes something else entirely. Uranus began to watch his children differently. Where he had once looked on their growing strength with something like satisfaction, he now saw only the shape of a future he could not control. Whispers moved through the young world, the kind of whispers that travel not through open air but through roots and stone and the deep, slow patience of the earth herself. Gaia felt them first, before anyone else did. A mother always seems to sense trouble gathering around her children before the trouble has fully arrived. She said nothing, not yet. She only watched, the way Earth watches everything eventually, with a patience that outlasts fear itself, but patience, even hers, has its limits, and somewhere beneath the surface of that still young, still forming world, something was about to happen that would change the shape of the heavens forever, something Gaia would not simply watch unfold from a distance, she would have a hand in it herself. Fear, once it takes root in someone, rarely stays quiet for long. Uranus had grown wary of his own children, and that wariness had begun to shape his actions in ways the young world had never seen before. Where once he had spread himself openly above Gaia, arching wide and generous across the sky, he now drew inward each time his children stirred beneath him. Their movements, once a source of pride, had become something he flinched from, so he did something no father had ever done, because there had been no fathers before him to set the precedent. He began to push his children back down, back into the deep, dark hollow of Gaia's own body, back into the earth from which they had barely emerged. The old stories describe this not as a single violent act but as something slower and more suffocating, a constant pressing down, a refusal to let his children fully exist in the open air they had only just begun to breathe. Imagine the weight of that. Imagine being formed, given shape, given the first taste of light and space, only to feel it all pulled away again by the very presence that made you. Gaia bore this weight in the most literal sense there is. Her children, crowded and crushed within her, filled her with an ache that had no name yet, because no one had ever needed a word for a mother's grief before. Old tellers describe this feeling settling into her the way frost settles into soil. Slow, spreading, and impossible to ignore once it takes hold. She could not simply endure it forever. Something had to give, so Gaia made something. Deep within herself, she shaped a substance harder than anything the world had known, gray and rough and gleaming faintly even in the dim early light. Flint, the old stories call it, though it was more than stone. It was resolve, given a cutting edge. She fashioned this material into a great curved blade, careful and deliberate, the way someone works when they know a task cannot be undone once it begins. Then she turned to her children, still pressed close within her, and asked which of them would be willing to use it. Silence answered her, at first. The Titans, for all their size and strength, hesitated. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from being asked to act against the one who made you, even when that one has become something to fear in return. One by one, her sons looked away, unwilling to be the hand that struck. Except for Cronus, he stepped forward, the old stories say, without hesitation, though whether that came from courage or from something colder and more calculating, no one could say for certain. Gaia placed the blade in his hand, and he closed his fingers around it the way someone closes their hand around something they have already decided to use. That night, if you could call it night in a world still learning the difference between dark and light, Uranus descended as he always did, spreading himself low and close over Gaia, unaware of what waited for him in the shadow of her form. Cronus was there, hidden, patient, the flint edge cold and ready. What happened next, the old tellers spoke of quickly and quietly, never lingering too long on the details, because even in an ancient story meant to ease a listener toward sleep, some moments are better felt than fully seen. Enough to say that Cronus struck, swift and final, and Uranus recoiled upward, wounded and diminished, retreating to a distance he would never again fully close. From that single, terrible act, strange things scattered into the world. Where drops fell upon the earth, new beings stirred into existence, some gentle, some fierce, each one a fragment of that broken moment given its own separate life. And far off, where the wound met the sea, something else began to take shape too. Something soft and pale, rising slowly from the foam, but her story would come later, for now, the sky had pulled back, wounded and wary, leaving a wider gap between himself and the earth than there had ever been before. And into that gap, into that new distance between above and below, Cronus stepped forward to claim what his father had left behind. With Uranus withdrawn to a wary distance, the world was left in the hands of his children, and for a while, that world knew a kind of peace it would never quite find again. Cronus took his father's place, not by pressing down on his siblings as Uranus had done, but by ruling openly, boldly, the way a young king rules before the weight of the crown has had time to settle uncomfortably on his brow. He took Rhea as his queen, gentle and steady, and together they became the center around which the other Titans arranged themselves. Oceanus continued his slow circuit around the edges of the world. Hyperion carried his quiet brightness across the sky each day, though no true sun yet blazed the way it would in later ages. Mnemosyne, keeper of memory, began the long, patient work of holding on to everything that happened, so that nothing in this new world would simply vanish once it had passed. It was a strange, in-between era. The old tellers, describing it to their listeners long after it had ended, often let a certain wistfulness creep into their voices here. The way anyone speaks of a time they've heard was better than their own, though they never lived it themselves. Crops, in this telling, needed no tending. They simply grew, full and abundant, wherever the ground was left undisturbed. Rivers ran clear and generous. There was no sickness yet to speak of, no sharp edge of winter to endure, no long stretches of hunger that forced anyone to look at their neighbor with suspicion instead of warmth. People, when they finally began to appear scattered across the hills and valleys, lived long, unhurried lives and passed from the world as gently as a candle burns down to nothing, without pain, without fear, more like drifting into a deep and welcome sleep than anything resembling loss. There is a particular kind of comfort in imagining a time before struggle existed at all, isn't there? A time when the ground gave freely, and no one had yet learned to want more than what the earth simply offered on its own. Cronus, for his part, ruled from something like a great open hall, though no walls yet enclosed it, no columns yet held up a roof. Just open air, and a kind of natural authority that didn't require ornamentation to be felt. Beneath him, the Titans governed their separate domains, sea and sky and memory and time itself, each one settling into a role the way water settles into the lowest part of a valley, following the shape of what came naturally to them. And yet, beneath even this golden quiet, something old and unresolved continued to wait. Gaia had not forgotten the warning that came before Cronus ever lifted the flint blade against his father. She had shaped Cronus into the instrument of Uranus's downfall, yes, but as she watched her son settle comfortably into power, a familiar unease began to stir in her once again. It was Uranus, in the last dim moments before his retreat, who had spoken the words that would follow Cronus through every peaceful season of his reign. That the same fate waiting to unmake a father by his child's hand would not spare the son who dealt it. Cronus heard this warning too, whispered on the same wind that carried every other secret across the young world. And where his father had responded to fear by pressing his children back into darkness, Cronus chose something else. Something he perhaps believed was safer, more certain, more within his control. He began to watch Rhea's growing belly with an attention that had nothing to do with tenderness, for now, though, the golden hall still stood open beneath a wide and generous sky. The rivers still ran clear. The people scattered across the hills still lived their long, gentle lives, unaware of the quiet dread taking root at the very top of the world they called home. It's a strange thing, isn't it, how a golden age can hold its shine even while the first cracks are already beginning to form beneath the surface, invisible to everyone except the one carrying the secret. Rhea, meanwhile, felt the first stirrings of new life within her, and did not yet know what that life would cost her. The child came at last, and with that arrival, the golden hall's quiet began to fray at the edges. Rhea felt the birth pain settle over her the way weather settles over a valley, gradual at first, then all at once impossible to ignore. She labored alone, in a hidden fold of the hills where even Cronus's watchful attention hadn't yet reached, and when the child finally arrived, small and new and utterly unaware of the danger already gathering around him, Rhea held him only for a moment before the fear returned in full, because she had seen what became of the children before him. Each time Rhea had given birth, Cronus had been there within the hour, gentle in his approach, almost tender. Before taking the newborn from her arms and doing the one thing that would ensure no child of his ever grew strong enough to challenge him the way he had once challenged his own father, he swallowed them whole, and without hesitation, as though a father consuming his own children were simply the price of certainty, the cost of never having to wonder what the future might bring. Rhea had watched this happen to Hestia, to Demeter, to Hera, to Hades, to Poseidon. 5 times, she had held new life in her arms only to have it taken and swallowed before the child had even opened its eyes to the world properly. 5 times, she had grieved in a silence that had nowhere else to go, because who could she turn to for comfort against a fear rooted in the very Titan she shared her throne with? This 6th time, though, something in her had hardened into resolve. She went to Gaia, the way a daughter returns to her mother when every other door has closed. And Gaia, who had once handed Cronus the very blade that started this entire cycle of fear and consumption, now turned her patient, ancient attention toward undoing what her son had become. Between them, mother and grandmother wove a plan simple enough to work precisely because it relied on the one thing Cronus never expected from anyone around him: deception. Rhea wrapped a large stone in swaddling cloth, shaping it carefully until it bore the rough weight and size of a newborn child. When Cronus arrived, as he always did, eager and anxious in equal measure, she offered the bundle to him without a tremor in her hands, though her heart must have been pounding loud enough to fill the whole hidden valley. He took it. He didn't unwrap it, didn't pause to look closely at what he was swallowing. He simply consumed it whole, the way he always had, satisfied once again that the future had been kept safely at bay. The real child, meanwhile, had already been carried far from that hidden valley, deep into the mountains of Crete, to a cave hollowed into rock on the slopes of Mount Ida. There, in the cool dark, hidden from every eye that might carry word back to his father, the infant Zeus began his life not in a golden hall, but in secrecy and shadow. He was not left entirely alone, though. The nymphs of that mountain took him in, feeding him on milk from a goat named Amalthea, whose gentle patience became the closest thing the hidden child had to a mother's presence in those early months. And when Zeus cried, as infants do, loud enough that the sound might have carried down the mountainside and reached ears that were listening for exactly this kind of thing, a group of young warriors called the Curetes took up their shields and spears and struck them together in a great clattering rhythm, drowning his cries beneath the clash of bronze. It's a strange image to sit with, isn't it? A god, destined to reshape the entire order of the heavens, spending his earliest days as nothing more than a hidden secret in a mountain cave, kept alive by a goat's milk and the deliberate noise of young men banging their shields together every time he wept. But hidden things have a way of growing regardless of how small they begin, and on that quiet mountain slope, far from his father's reach, far from the golden hall and its buried unease, the child who would one day undo everything Cronus had built grew slowly, steadily, patiently, toward the moment he would finally come down from the mountain. Years passed on that mountain slope in ways that were hard to measure, since there was still no sun crossing the sky with the steady rhythm we know now, only the slow, patient turning of seasons across Crete's hidden valleys, Zeus grew the way hidden things sometimes grow best, quietly, steadily, without anyone watching closely enough to notice how much strength was gathering in him. The nymphs who raised him watched a small, crying infant become a boy, and then something more than a boy, broad-shouldered and clear-eyed, carrying himself with a stillness that felt older than his years. There was a weight to the way he moved through that mountain cave, the same kind of coiled patience his father had once carried. Though in Zeus it settled into something calmer, more deliberate, he knew who he was. The nymphs had never hidden that truth from him, and Gaia herself, watching from a distance the way she always did, made certain the boy understood exactly what waited for him beyond the safety of Mount Ida. A father who had swallowed 5 of his siblings before he'd even taken his first breath. A golden hall built on top of a secret so heavy it had bent an entire generation of gods into hiding. When the time finally came, Zeus did not descend the mountain in anger, sword raised, the way a simpler story might have shaped it. He came down slowly, deliberately, with something closer to strategy than fury guiding his steps. He found Metis first, a titan whose cleverness ran deeper than almost anyone else's in that ancient world, and together they devised something quieter than a direct confrontation. Metis prepared a draft, mixed with care and a kind of grim precision, and found a way to have it delivered into Cronus as food without his notice. It's worth pausing here on how strange it must have felt for Zeus, waiting somewhere nearby while his father unknowingly swallowed the very thing that would undo years of careful concealment. What happened next unfolded the way an old wound sometimes reopens all at once, sudden and total. Cronus, gripped by the draft's effect, began to retch violently, and from him came back everything he had swallowed all those years before. First the stone rear had once wrapped in swaddling cloth, tumbling out into the light after decades of sitting undisturbed in the dark of him. Then, one after another, his children. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. Each of them emerging fully grown, untouched by time in the strange way gods seemed to be, blinking against a light they hadn't seen since infancy. Imagine that reunion. 5 siblings, none of whom had ever known each other outside their father's own body, suddenly standing together in the open air for the first time, disoriented, unsteady, and slowly beginning to understand who had orchestrated their release. Zeus stood among them, the youngest by birth but somehow already carrying himself as something closer to a leader. There was no time for a long, tearful reunion, though. Cronus, humiliated and furious in equal measure, was already gathering his strength, already calling on the other titans to stand with him against this child he had failed to erase from existence. The Golden Hall, the one that had stood open and generous under a peaceful sky for so long, would not stay peaceful much longer. Zeus looked at his brothers and sisters, freed but frightened, still finding their footing after a lifetime spent in darkness they couldn't remember. He did not ask them to rush into anything. Instead, the old tellers say, he simply told them what was coming, plainly and without embellishment, the way someone describes a storm gathering on the horizon before it's arrived. He told them their father would not step aside willingly. He told them the other titans, loyal to Cronus out of habit or fear, would likely stand against them too, and he told them that despite all of it, despite the imbalance of strength and the weight of everything Cronus had already survived, he did not intend to hide any longer. Somewhere beyond that gathering of newly freed siblings, across the wider world Gaia had shaped so long ago, the other titans were already beginning to stir, sensing that the golden quiet they had known for so long was drawing to a close. What came next would not be small. It would not be quiet. it would reshape the heavens themselves. There is a particular stillness that settles over a world just before it breaks apart, and that stillness had already begun to fade by the time Zeus and his siblings stood together in the open air. Cronus did not waste time on grief over what he had lost. Wounded pride, in a being who had once cut down his own father to secure his throne, curdled quickly into something harder and more purposeful. He called upon the other Titans, most of whom had known nothing of his secret shame, and framed the coming conflict not as a father's failure but as a threat to everything they had built together. Some answered that call out of genuine loyalty. Others, perhaps, simply because the golden order they had always known felt safer than whatever these 6 unfamiliar young gods might bring in its place. Not every Titan chose Cronus's side, though. This is worth pausing on, because it would have been easy for the old stories to paint this conflict as a simple, clean divide, elder gods against younger ones, with no room for anything in between. But the truth carried more texture than that. Oceanus, keeper of the great river encircling the world, chose to withdraw entirely, unwilling to take up arms against either side. Themis, goddess of order and fair judgment, found herself drawn instead toward Zeus and the fairness she sensed in his cause. And Prometheus, a name that would matter a great deal later in this story, looked at the coming war with a clarity his fellow Titans lacked, and chose to stand apart from his own kind. Zeus, meanwhile, understood something his father never fully grasped. Strength alone would not be enough to win what was coming. He needed allies whose power matched or exceeded anything the Titans could offer, and he knew exactly where to look. Deep beneath the earth, in a place even darker than the cave that had hidden Zeus through his own childhood, there were beings Cronus had once locked away out of the same fear that had driven so much of this entire story. The Cyclopes, single-eyed and immensely strong, skilled beyond measure in forging things no other hands could shape. And beyond them, further still into the dark, the Hecatoncheirs, vast creatures with 100 hands each, whose strength alone could have reshaped mountains had anyone ever given them the chance to try. Zeus went to them himself, descending into that ancient darkness the way he had once descended his own mountain, calm and deliberate despite what waited below. He freed them, the old stories say, not with grand promises or empty flattery, but with something closer to simple respect, an acknowledgement of the injustice done to them and a genuine request for their help in ending it. Gratitude, when it is earned rather than demanded, tends to run deep. The Cyclopes, in return for their freedom, turned their considerable skill toward crafting weapons unlike anything the young world had yet seen. For Zeus, they forged the thunderbolt, jagged and brilliant, a weapon that would come to define him more than any other. For Poseidon, they shaped a great trident, humming faintly with a power drawn from the depths of the sea he was destined to rule. And for Hades, quieter and stranger than either gift given to his brothers, they crafted a helm that could render its wearer entirely unseen, a gift suited perfectly to a god who would one day govern a realm most living things preferred not to think about at all. Armed now with weapons no Titan could match, and standing alongside siblings who had spent their entire existence hidden inside their father until mere moments ago, Zeus turned to face the gathering storm of Cronus's assembled forces. The Hecatoncheirs, freed alongside the Cyclopes, offered their 100-handed strength to the coming fight, a promise that whatever violence lay ahead would not be a contest of equals. The mist stood quietly with them too, lending her sense of rightful order to a cause she believed deserved it. Across the wide, still forming world, two sides had finally taken shape. On one stood Cronus, ancient and proud, backed by most of the Titans who had ruled the Golden Age without ever imagining it might end. On the other stood Zeus, young and newly whole, backed by freed prisoners grateful beyond measure and siblings who had only just learned what it meant to stand in open air. Between them lay a silence that would not hold for very much longer. What came next was not a single clash but a war that stretched across the young world for what felt, to those caught within it, like an age unto itself. The old tellers, describing this part of the story, always slowed their voices here, not to build excitement but almost the opposite, to soften what might otherwise have felt overwhelming. Because this was not a small skirmish between a few gathered figures. This was mountains lifted from their roots and hurled across the sky. This was rivers boiling in their beds from forces passing too close overhead. This was the very fabric of the young earth groaning under the weight of powers it had never been asked to hold before. Zeus led his side from the front, the thunderbolt in his hand crackling with a light that hadn't existed in the world until the Cyclopes forged it. Each time he raised it, the sky itself seemed to shudder, as though even the heavens were still deciding whether they could bear such a weapon. Poseidon fought differently, quieter in some ways, though no less devastating, his trident calling up water where there had been none, flooding low valleys and turning solid ground into treacherous, shifting mud beneath the feet of any Titan who stood against him. The Hecatoncheirs proved every bit as decisive as Zeus had hoped when he freed them from their long imprisonment. With 100 hands each, they gathered boulders the size of small hills and hurled them across vast distances, a rain of stone that no ordinary army could have withstood. It's worth pausing on the strangeness of this image, isn't it? These vast, many-handed beings, so long confined to darkness, suddenly given the chance to stretch every one of those 100 arms at once, throwing with a force that reshaped the very landscape they landed on. Cronus, for his part, did not stand passively against this onslaught. Whatever else could be said of him, he had not survived his own father's fall and built an entire golden age on top of it by lacking strength or cunning. He rallied the Titans still loyal to him, and together they matched blow for blow in those early exchanges, the war swinging first one way and then the other, with neither side gaining ground long enough to feel certain of victory. For a long while, it seemed as though this struggle might simply continue, unresolved, stretching on until the world itself wore thin from the strain of holding it. The old stories speak of entire seasons passing this way, the fighting neither escalating nor easing, just grinding forward in a kind of exhausted, relentless rhythm. What finally tipped the balance was not a single dramatic stroke, but the accumulated weight of everything Zeus had gathered around him. The freed prisoners fought with a gratitude sharpened into purpose. The siblings who had spent their whole existence hidden inside their father fought with the fierce, unpracticed intensity of those only recently given the chance to stand in open air at all. And Zeus himself, learning the shape of his own power with every passing exchange, grew steadier, more certain, more like the god the rest of this story would come to know him as. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Titans who had once seemed unshakable found themselves pressed backward, step by step, toward the edges of the world Gaia had shaped so long ago. The boulders kept falling. The thunderbolts kept striking. The floodwaters kept rising around the feet of those still trying to hold their ground. There is something almost sorrowful in imagining this moment from the Titan side, isn't there? An entire generation, once golden and unquestioned, finding the ground giving way beneath them for reasons that had begun so long ago, with nothing more than a father's quiet, creeping fear. By the time the fighting finally began to subside, the world itself looked different than it had before the war began. New valleys had opened where none existed. Old rivers had shifted course entirely. And Cronus, along with most of the Titans who had stood beside him, found themselves with nowhere left to retreat to. The war was not quite finished yet. But its ending, for the first time since it began, had started to feel inevitable. By the time the final stretch of the war arrived, exhaustion had settled over both sides like a heavy fog, but only one side still had the strength left to press forward with any real momentum. Zeus felt it first, a shift that had nothing to do with tactics or weapons and everything to do with something harder to name. Call it inevitability, or the particular certainty that comes when a struggle has tipped past its turning point and started sliding, unstoppably, toward its conclusion. His forces had begun the war outnumbered and untested. Now, standing among the freed prisoners and newly whole siblings who had fought beside him through every grinding season of that long conflict, he felt something closer to command than desperation for the first time. Cronus felt the same shift, though from the opposite side of it, and the old tellers say there was a particular kind of grief in watching him recognize it. Whatever else this Titan king had been, proud, fearful, willing to swallow his own children rather than risk losing his throne, he had also once been the one who freed the world from Uranus's suffocating grip. There is a strange, sad symmetry in watching a figure who rose to power by overthrowing a fearful father now facing the same fate at his own son's hands. The final confrontations came swiftly once that shift settled in. The Hecatoncheirs, still throwing with the same tireless strength they'd carried since their release, drove the last organized resistance back toward the very edges of the world Gaia had shaped so long ago. Titan by Titan, the golden order that had ruled since Cronus first claimed his throne began to crumble, not all at once, but in a steady, irreversible unraveling. When it finally ended, there was no grand final duel, no single decisive strike that the old stories lingered over dramatically. Instead, there was simply a quiet, exhausted stillness, the kind that follows any long struggle once every reserve of strength has finally been spent. Cronus stood among his defeated brothers, the fight gone out of him, the golden hall he had once ruled from now nothing more than a memory of a world that no longer existed in the same shape. Zeus, victorious but not cruel about it, faced the question every conqueror eventually must answer. What do you do with those you've defeated? He chose imprisonment over destruction, a decision the old tellers often paused on, since it revealed something about the young god that would matter throughout the rest of this story. Most of the Titans who had fought against him, Cronus among them, were sent down into Tartarus, a place deeper and darker than anywhere in the world above, further beneath the earth than even the cave that had once hidden the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheirs from the light. Bronze walls, the old stories say, rose around that place, and a great gate sealed it shut, guarded ever after by the very Hecatoncheirs whose freedom had helped bring this whole long war to its conclusion. There was a certain fitting balance in that arrangement, wasn't there? The ones once imprisoned now standing watch over the ones who had done the imprisoning. Not every Titan shared this fate, though. Those who had refused to stand against Zeus, Oceanus in his quiet neutrality, Themis in her early support, found themselves spared the darkness of Tartarus entirely, allowed to continue much as they always had, their roles in the world unchanged by the war that had reshaped everything else around them. One Titan received a punishment shaped specifically for him, distinct from all the others. Atlas, who had fought fiercely and stubbornly for his father's cause until the very end, was given the heavens themselves to carry, a burden the old tellers describe not with cruelty but with a kind of somber inevitability, as though the sky needed shoulders strong enough to bear it. And Atlas, whatever else could be said of him, had never lacked for strength. With the war finally over and the losing side settled into whatever fate awaited each of them, a strange quiet spread across the young world once more. not unlike the quiet that had followed Cronus's own rise to power so long before. But this quiet felt different. Heavier, somehow, with the knowledge of everything it had cost to reach it. Zeus and his siblings stood together now, victorious, untested rulers of a world still settling from the upheaval of their rise. Ahead of them lay a task even larger than the war they had just survived. They would need to decide, among themselves, how such a world should be governed at all. With the war finally over and the last of Cronus's loyal titans settled into their fates, a new kind of silence spread across the world, one that had nothing left to fight against, and everything left to figure out. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades stood together in the aftermath, three brothers who had spent the earliest part of their existence hidden inside their own father, now facing the strange task of deciding how to rule a world that had never truly belonged to anyone but titans before. There was no established custom to follow here, no precedent carved into stone from some earlier age. Whatever they decided, they would be deciding for the first time. The old tellers described this moment with a certain quiet fondness. A brief pause of calm deliberation after everything that had come before it. No shouting. No renewed conflict between siblings who had only just learned to trust one another during the long war. Just three brothers, weighing the shape of a world still settling from the upheaval of its own remaking. They chose lots, in the end, rather than argument or force, a decision that says something about the kind of order Zeus hoped to build in place of the fear that had defined his father's reign. Each of them would draw for their share of the world, and whatever fell to them, they would rule without contesting what the others received. Poseidon drew the sea, and something in him seemed to settle the moment the lot fell his way, as though the restless, churning nature of open water had always suited him better than solid ground ever could. He took to his new domain with an energy that felt less like obligation and more like recognition, the way a traveler feels arriving somewhere they'd never visited before but somehow already understood. Beneath the waves, in the deep quiet places even the war above had never touched, he began to shape something of his own. Coral halls and drifting currents, a kingdom built from water instead of stone. Hades drew the underworld, and if there was disappointment in that outcome, the old stories say he never let it show in any way the others could see. Perhaps he understood, even then, that someone needed to govern the quiet realm beneath the earth, the place where every living thing would eventually find its way regardless of how golden or difficult their time above had been. He descended without complaint, taking up residence in halls that had, until then, existed mostly as an idea, a destination rather than a proper kingdom. Zeus, drawing last, took the sky, though in truth it had already felt like his before the lots were ever cast. There was something fitting in that, wasn't there? The god who had once been hidden in a mountain cave, kept from the light by his father's fear, now claiming the very open air that had been denied him for so long. The earth itself, along with the wide surface where mortals and immortals alike would come to walk, remained common ground, belonging to none of the three brothers exclusively, shared among them and among all the gods who would soon gather to help govern this newly reordered world. It's worth pausing here on how different this division felt from everything that came before it. Uranus had ruled through suffocating control. Cronus had ruled through fear disguised as caution. But this quiet drawing of lots between three brothers who had chosen cooperation over rivalry, however uneasy that cooperation might still feel in these early days, hinted at something the world hadn't quite seen yet. A different kind of order entirely. Whether that order would hold, whether three young gods freshly risen from war could govern as steadily as they had fought, remained an open question, one that would only be answered with time. For now, though, sea and sky and underworld had each found a ruler, and the long work of shaping a new age, one built from cooperation rather than fear, had only just begun. With sea and sky and underworld settled among the three brothers, something else began to take shape in the quiet that followed, something less about territory and more about family. The five siblings freed from Cronus's grasp, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, along with Zeus himself, had spent so long defined by what their father had done to them that few had paused yet to consider who they might become now that the war was behind them. That question started to answer itself slowly, the way most real transformations do, not in a single dramatic moment but through the accumulated weight of everyday choices. Hestia, eldest of the six and the first to be swallowed all those years ago, found her place not in ruling any distant realm but in something quieter and, in its own way, more essential. She became the keeper of the hearth, the steady flame at the center of every home and every gathering, mortal or divine. There is something worth sitting with in that choice, isn't there? After everything she had endured, after being the very first to vanish into darkness at her father's hand, she chose warmth. She chose the kind of presence that asks for no glory and simply tends, patiently, to whatever fire needs keeping alive. Demeter turned her attention toward the earth itself, toward the slow, quiet work of making things grow. Where Gaia had shaped the raw ground long ago, Demeter concerned herself with what that ground could yield, season by season, harvest by harvest. Fields that had once grown wild and unattended under the Golden Age's easy abundance now found a goddess who understood their rhythms, who could coax grain from soil and knew, in some deep instinctive way, the difference between a field ready to give and one that needed rest. Hera's path unfolded differently, and more gradually. There was a natural gravity to her, a bearing that made others look toward her when questions of order and propriety arose among the gods. In time, she would come to stand beside Zeus not merely as a sibling freed alongside him, but as something far more central to the world they were building together, though that particular chapter of her story had not yet fully arrived. Zeus, meanwhile, found himself settling into a role that extended beyond simply ruling the sky. The other gods, freed and newly whole, had fought beside him through the long war, and in its aftermath, they looked to him with something that hadn't quite existed before among their kind. A kind of trust placed voluntarily rather than extracted through fear. He hadn't demanded that position the way Cronus once demanded obedience through consumption and threat. It had simply settled onto him, the way authority sometimes does when it's earned through shared struggle rather than seized through force. Beyond the six siblings themselves, other gods began to gather around this new center of power, drawn by kinship, by shared purpose, by the simple gravitational pull of a golden age reforming itself after war. Some were children of titans who had chosen not to fight, the Miss among them, her steady sense of fairness finding a natural home in this new order. Others would come later, born from union still waiting to unfold, though their arrival would each carry its own particular story worth telling in its own time. What mattered most in this quieter stretch, though, wasn't any single birth or arrival, but the shape the whole gathering was slowly taking. A mountain far to the north had begun to draw their collective attention, its peak often wrapped in cloud, its slopes untouched by any settlement below. Olympus, the old tellers called it, though in these early days it was still more idea than palace, more destination than home. The gods who would come to be known as Olympians hadn't yet claimed that mountain fully. They were still finding their footing, still learning what it meant to govern not through fear but through whatever fragile, untested cooperation six siblings and their gathered kin could manage to build together. But the shape of something lasting had begun to form, quietly, the way most lasting things do. Not with a proclamation. Not with a single decisive moment, just gods, slowly finding their place in a world finally at peace, and a mountain waiting patiently for them to arrive. There is a particular kind of settling that happens after a war ends and a peace begins to feel less fragile, and it was in that settling that Hera's story began to take on a shape of its own. She had been freed alongside her siblings, pulled from the darkness that had held her since infancy. Unlike the others, she had spent the war finding her footing in a world she'd only just been given access to. But where Hestia turned toward the hearth and Demeter toward the fields, Hera's gifts leaned somewhere else entirely, toward order itself, toward the careful, deliberate work of holding things together once they'd been won. Zeus noticed this about her, the old tellers say, long before either of them spoke of what it might mean. There was a steadiness to Hera that matched something restless in him, a counterweight rather than a mirror. Where Zeus moved through the world with the confident, expansive energy of someone still discovering the full reach of his own power, Hera carried herself with the patience of someone who understood that power without structure eventually collapses under its own weight. Their courtship, if it can even be called that, unfolded slowly, without the drama the old stories sometimes attached to such things. Zeus approached her carefully, aware perhaps that Hera was not the kind of goddess who could be won through spectacle alone. Their union, when it finally came, felt less like a single event and more like the natural conclusion of two forces recognizing they were stronger joined than apart. Hera became queen not simply through marriage, but through the role she had already been quietly building for herself since the moment she first stepped free into open air. She took to that role with a seriousness that would come to define her for ages afterward. Marriage itself, and the sacred bonds a household depends on, fell increasingly under her particular care. Where Zeus governed the wide sweep of sky and storm, Hera governed something more intimate but no less essential, the invisible threads that held families, and by extension the whole divine order, together. Poseidon, meanwhile, was settling into his own kingdom beneath the waves with an energy entirely his own. The sea, restless and vast, suited a god who had spent so long confined and controlled before finally being given room to move freely. He was building something down there, coral halls rising slowly from the ocean floor. Currents learning to answer to his will the way wind might answer to Zeus's. There was a wildness to Poseidon that never quite matched his brother's more measured authority, and the old tellers note this difference with a certain gentle fondness, the way you might describe two brothers who love each other but were clearly never meant to rule the same domain. It's worth pausing here on how different this new order felt from everything that preceded it. Uranus had ruled through suppression. Cronus had ruled through fear disguised as protection. But what Zeus, Hera, and Poseidon were building together, however imperfectly, carried a different texture entirely, one where distinct temperaments found distinct domains. Rather than a single will pressing every corner of existence into the same fearful shape. That is not to say this new order arrived without friction. Poseidon's restlessness occasionally chafed against the boundaries his brother's rule implied, small disagreements rippling outward the way currents ripple across otherwise still water. Hera, for her part, watched the wider world with a careful, sometimes exacting eye, aware that the order she was helping build remained new enough to still require constant, patient tending, but beneath whatever friction surfaced in these early days, something durable was taking hold. A sky god and his queen, a sea god finding the shape of his own kingdom, siblings who had once known only darkness now governing the very world that had been kept from them for so long. And somewhere beyond the borders of what they had already claimed, other stories were beginning to stir, other births still waiting to unfold, each one destined to add another thread to the order slowly taking shape around that quiet, cloud-wrapped mountain to the north. Not every birth in this unfolding story came about the way Zeus and his siblings had arrived in the world, and none carried quite the strangeness of what happened next. It began, as many things in this new order did, with a warning. Metis, the clever Titan who had once helped Zeus free his siblings from within Cronus, had by this time become far more than an ally to him. She had become someone he trusted deeply, someone whose cleverness he had come to rely on in ways he rarely relied on anyone. But when word reached him, carried on the same old currents of prophecy that had once warned Cronus of his own downfall, that any child born of Metis would eventually surpass its father. Zeus felt something he recognized all too well. It's worth sitting with that moment for a while, isn't it? Here was a god who had spent his own childhood hidden in a mountain cave precisely because his father feared this exact kind of prophecy. Zeus knew, better than almost anyone in that new order, what fear like this could do to a ruler. He had watched it curdle his own father into something that swallowed his children whole rather than risk the future they represented, and yet, faced with the same warning, Zeus found himself reaching for an answer that echoed his father's. However different its shape turned out to be, he swallowed Metis. Not out of the same desperate cruelty that had driven Cronus, the old tellers are careful to note, but out of something more complicated, a genuine affection tangled together with an old, inherited fear he hadn't quite managed to outgrow. Metis, already carrying a child by then, simply became part of him, folded into his very being in a way no one, not even Zeus himself, fully understood in that moment. For a long while afterward, nothing seemed to happen. Zeus governed as he always had, the sky answering to his will, the gods gathering slowly around that distant mountain. If he thought of Metis at all in those quiet months, he kept it to himself, the way a person carries a private ache they've decided not to examine too closely. Then came the headaches. They started small, the old stories say, barely noticeable at first, but growing steadily worse until Zeus found himself unable to think past the pain gathering behind his own eyes. No remedy the other gods offered seemed to touch it. Days passed this way, then longer stretches still, until the pain had become something none of them could simply wait out any longer. It was Hephaestus, skilled beyond measure with his hands, who finally stepped forward with an idea born more of desperation than certainty. He took up his tools, an axe forged with the same careful precision he brought to everything he made, and against what must have felt like every reasonable instinct. He struck Zeus across the forehead. What emerged from that strike was unlike anything the young order of gods had witnessed before. Not blood, not injury in any way that made sense, but a goddess, fully formed, stepping out into the light already dressed for battle, spear in hand, her eyes carrying a sharpness that spoke of wisdom rather than youth. Athena, she had not grown in darkness the way Zeus once had, hidden and waiting. She arrived complete, already carrying her mother's cleverness and something else entirely her own, a clear, unclouded judgment that would come to define her among the gathering Olympians. There was no infancy to speak of, no gradual unfolding. She simply was, the moment Hephaestus's axe found its mark. Fully herself from her very first breath, the other gods, watching this happen, felt something shift in the order they were still learning to build together. Here was proof, however strange its arrival, that this new family of gods could produce something entirely unprecedented, a wisdom born not from age or experience, but present, complete, from the very instant of creation. Zeus, headache gone the moment his daughter stepped free, looked at her with something the old tellers describe as quiet, startled pride. Whatever fear had driven him to swallow her mother, whatever old shadow of Cronus had briefly darkened his judgment, dissolved somewhat in the presence of what had come from it. Athena would not remain a curiosity for long. She would take her place among the Olympians as one of their sharpest minds, a goddess whose wisdom the others would come to seek out again and again in the ages still unfolding ahead of them. Not all births among the gods carried the strangeness of Athena's arrival, but that didn't make them any less significant to the order slowly taking shape around Olympus. Leto, a titan whose gentleness set her apart from many of her kin, found herself carrying twins by Zeus, a fact that reached Hera's attention with an unease that would come to define much of what followed. Hera's care for the sanctity of marriage, the very thing that had made her so essential to the order she and Zeus were building together, meant she felt any threat to that bond as something worth guarding against fiercely. Leto, caught in the middle of a tension that had little to do with her directly, found herself unwelcome nearly everywhere she turned. No island or shore willing to risk Hera's displeasure by offering her shelter. It's worth sitting with what that must have felt like, wandering a world still new enough that safety wasn't guaranteed anywhere, carrying two lives within her and finding every door quietly closed before she'd even had the chance to knock. She found refuge, eventually, on a small, floating island called Delos, a place so unremarkable and untethered that it existed somewhat outside the usual reach of Hera's watchful displeasure. There, among rough ground and scattered palm trees, Leto gave birth, first to a daughter, and then, after some further labor, to a son. Artemis came first, and the old tellers linger a little on the strangeness of what happened next. That this newborn goddess, only just arrived herself, turned almost immediately to help her mother through the remaining labor. There was something in that early act that would come to define her entirely, an instinct toward fierce, protective care that extended outward to every wild and vulnerable thing she would eventually govern. Apollo arrived after her, and where his sister's nature turned toward shadowed groves and untamed places, his leaned toward clarity, toward light in its most literal and its most metaphorical sense. Even as an infant, the old stories say, there was something luminous about him, a presence that seemed to draw brightness into whatever space he occupied. The twins grew quickly, the way gods often did in these early tellings, and as they matured, the balance between them became one of the more striking pairings among the gathering Olympians. Artemis took to the forests and hills, a goddess of the hunt, yes, but more precisely a guardian of wild things, fiercely protective of creatures and places that had no voice of their own to demand protection. She moved through untamed country with an ease that made her seem almost native to it, more comfortable among rustling leaves and distant birdsong than within any golden hall. Apollo's domain stretched differently, toward music and prophecy, toward healing, and toward the sun's steady, illuminating arc across the sky. Where Artemis governed the quiet, hidden corners of the world, Apollo governed clarity itself, truth spoken plainly, light falling evenly across whatever it touched. He would come to be closely tied to Delphi, where mortals seeking answers to questions too large for themselves would travel great distances just to hear what wisdom the god of light might offer them. Together, brother and sister formed a kind of balance that the still-forming order of Olympus seemed to need, wild instinct paired against clear illumination, the untamed corners of existence held in careful tension with the parts of life that craved understanding and light. Hera's early hostility toward their mother softened somewhat as the years passed, though the old tellers note it never fully vanished, a lingering reminder that this new divine family, however cooperative it aimed to be, still carried tensions inherited from the very structure of its own creation. Leto, watching her two children grow into gods whose influence would stretch across every corner of the mortal world for ages to come, found in that quiet island exile something she likely hadn't expected to find there at all. not just safety, in the end, but the beginning of two lives that would shape the balance of an entire divine order still settling into its final form. Far from the sunlit balance Apollo and Artemis had brought to the world above, another kind of order had been steadily taking shape in a realm most gods rarely thought to visit at all. Hades had descended into the underworld without complaint when the lots were drawn so long ago, and in the time since, he had done something few of his siblings fully appreciated. He had built an actual kingdom out of what once existed as little more than an idea. The old tellers, when they speak of this realm, do so gently, aware that listeners drifting towards sleep don't need vivid horror, only the quiet truth of a place that every living thing would eventually come to know. The underworld was not chaos. And it was not punishment for its own sake. It was order, of a very particular kind, patient and unhurried, suited perfectly to a god whose temperament had always leaned toward stillness rather than spectacle. Rivers ran through that realm the way rivers ran through the world above, though these carried names heavy with meaning, the Styx, dark and binding, upon whose waters even the gods swore oaths they dared not break. The Lethe, slow and silver, its waters carrying forgetfulness to any soul that drank from them, a mercy some might call it, a soft unburdening for those who had carried too much through their mortal years. Hades did not rule this realm through cruelty. That distinction mattered greatly, the old stories insist, because it would have been easy for a lesser telling to paint him as some grim tyrant delighting in the suffering of the dead. He wasn't that at all. He was something closer to a quiet steward, someone who understood that death needed a place as much as life did, and that place deserved order rather than neglect. Cerberus kept watch at the entrance, a great hound with 3 heads, though even he served more as a keeper of balance than an instrument of terror, ensuring that those who belonged in that realm remained there, and that the boundary between the living world and this quieter one stayed properly maintained. It's worth pausing on the strange gentleness in that arrangement, a guardian not meant to torment, only to preserve the necessary line between what came before and what comes after. Persephone had not yet arrived in this part of the story, her own tale still waiting further down the long thread of everything still unfolding among these gods. For now, Hades ruled alone, walking through dim, spacious halls that stretched further than anyone above ever fully imagined, tending to a realm that asked for patience rather than glory. There is something worth noticing in how differently each of the 3 brothers had come to inhabit their inheritance. Zeus ruled visibly, his presence felt in every storm that rolled across the sky, every bolt of lightning that split the clouds. Poseidon ruled restlessly, his kingdom in constant motion, currents shifting, tides rising and falling with a wildness that mirrored his own nature. Hades, though, ruled from beneath everything, unseen by most, his authority felt only in the quiet certainty that every soul, eventually, would find its way to him. The other Olympians, gathering ever more frequently around their distant, cloud-wrapped mountain, rarely spoke of Hades' realm, not out of scorn, but out of the particular kind of silence people reserve for things too large and too certain to examine closely very often. He remained apart from their gatherings more often than not, content in a solitude that suited him, though the old tellers note a certain loneliness in that choice too, a brother who had drawn the quietest lot and settled into it without complaint, even as his siblings built their golden halls in the open air above him. It is easy, in a story so full of light and sky and thunder, to forget the brother who chose to rule what no one else wanted. But every order needs a foundation as much as it needs a crown, and Hades, patient and unshowy, had become exactly that. A quiet keeper, holding steady beneath everything the other gods were still building above him. Not every important figure in this unfolding order stood among the Olympians gathered on their distant mountain. Some worked quietly, apart from that golden company, tending to something older and, in its own way, more fragile. Prometheus had stood apart from his fellow Titans during the war, choosing clarity over kinship when the choice had mattered most. That decision had spared him the fate of Cronus and the others, and in the peaceful stretch that followed, he turned his attention toward something the gathering gods had largely overlooked in their own celebrations: the small, struggling creatures scattered across the wide earth Gaia had shaped so long ago. Humanity, in these earliest days, existed as something fragile and unfinished. The old tellers describe them wandering cold hillsides without real shelter, eating what they could find raw and unprepared, huddling together against nights that stretched long and merciless without any warmth to soften them. There is a particular tenderness in imagining Prometheus watching these small, shivering figures, so unlike the towering titans and gods who had spent the earlier chapters of this story reshaping the heavens themselves. He had helped shape them too, in some tellings, molding early humans from river clay with a care that suggested affection rather than obligation. Whether or not that particular detail holds true in every version of this story, what remains constant is the deep, quiet fondness Prometheus carried for these fragile beings, a fondness the other gods, caught up in their own new order, didn't entirely share or understand. Zeus, settling into his rule from Olympus, viewed humanity with a more distant kind of interest, useful perhaps, worth some measure of care, but not deserving of gifts that belonged, by rights, to gods alone. Fire sat chief among those gifts, a thing so essential to warmth and safety and the slow work of building anything lasting that its absence kept humanity forever teetering on the edge of a hardship the gods themselves never had to endure. Prometheus asked, at first, the old stories say. He brought humanity's plight before Zeus plainly, without exaggeration, hoping reason alone might soften a decision that seemed, to him, needlessly cruel. Zeus refused. Fire, he said, was not humanity's to have. A boundary meant to keep mortal and immortal properly separated, each in their appropriate place within the order still settling into shape. It's worth pausing on what it must have cost Prometheus to accept that answer and then quietly decide to defy it anyway. He was not reckless by nature. Everything about his character, the caution that had kept him from Cronus's side during the war, suggested someone who weighed consequences carefully before acting. And yet, watching humanity shiver through another cold season, he made his choice. He traveled to Olympus and took a single glowing ember from the sacred hearth, the very flame Hestia tended with such quiet devotion, and hid it inside a hollow fennel stalk. Its pale pith smoldering slowly enough to carry the fire without consuming it entirely on the journey down. Then he descended to the earth below and placed that small, flickering gift into human hands for the first time. The change that followed unfolded gradually, the way most real transformations do. Fires began appearing on distant hillsides, small points of warm light scattered across a landscape that had known only cold darkness before. Humanity learned to cook what they gathered, to forge crude tools, to gather together around a shared flame in a way that began, slowly, to resemble something like community rather than mere survival. Zeus noticed, of course. A god who governed the sky missed very little that happened beneath it, and the sight of fire burning where no fire should exist told him immediately what had happened, and who had defied him to make it so. His anger, when it came, was not quick to fade. Prometheus had broken a boundary Zeus considered essential to the order he was still carefully building, and whatever fondness existed between them from the war they had once stood through together did little to soften what came next. But that reckoning, heavy and lasting as it would prove to be, belongs to a chapter still ahead of us, for now, scattered across the hillsides of a still young world, Small fires burned through the night for the very first time, and humanity, huddled close around their warmth, began to imagine a future that had, until that quiet act of defiance, remained entirely out of reach. With fire now flickering across distant hillsides below, and the Great Wall long since settled into memory, the gods themselves had begun to turn their attention toward something they had only loosely considered before: the shape of a proper home. Olympus had always been there, cloud-wrapped and quiet, watching over the unfolding events of this whole long story without ever fully entering it. But as Zeus, Hera, and the growing company of siblings and children settled into their respective roles, that distant mountain stopped feeling like a mere backdrop and started feeling, instead, like a destination they had been slowly moving toward all along. The old tellers described this settling not as a single grand construction, but as something that accumulated gradually, the way a household takes shape over years rather than all at once. Halls rose from the mountain's upper slopes, not built by mortal hands but seeming to emerge from the will of the gods themselves, each structure suited to the particular temperament of whichever Olympian claimed it. Hephaestus, still recovering perhaps from the strange work of freeing Athena, turned his considerable skill toward crafting much of what rose there, forges glowing somewhere within the mountain's higher reaches, producing thrones and gates and ornamentation unlike anything the world below had yet seen. There is a particular kind of peace in imagining this stretch of the story, isn't there, after so much upheaval, after fathers swallowing children and wars reshaping valleys and a goddess born from her father's own forehead. Here, finally, was a chapter defined not by conflict but by the quieter work of building something meant to last. Zeus took his place at the center of it, not through demand but through the same gradual gravity that had drawn authority toward him since the war's end. His throne, when it was finally raised, sat highest among the gathered halls, though the old stories are careful to note this wasn't merely about dominance. It reflected the role he had settled into, less a tyrant surveying his domain and more a steady point around which the rest of this new family could organize itself. Hera's presence shaped the mountain just as thoroughly, her care for order and household extending naturally into the architecture of Olympus itself. Where Zeus's throne suggested reach and authority, the halls Hera oversaw carried a different quality. Warmth folded into structure, a sense that this mountain wasn't simply a seat of power but genuinely meant to be lived in. The other gods found their own corners of that growing home. Poseidon, though his true domain remained far below in the restless sea, kept a presence on Olympus too, a reminder that even the most independent of the siblings still belonged, in some essential way, to this gathered family. Athena's halls carried the quiet, ordered elegance you might expect from a goddess born already wise, shelves and spaces that seemed built for contemplation as much as habitation. Apollo and Artemis moved between the mountain and the wilder world below with an ease that suited their nature. Never quite as settled as some of the others, always drawn back toward sunlight and forest in equal measure. It's worth pausing here on how different this gathering felt from the golden hall Cronus once ruled from. That earlier home, open and unwalled, had carried a kind of exposed vulnerability beneath its abundance, a peace that turned out to be resting on buried fear. Olympus, by contrast, felt built rather than simply occupied, each hall and hearth a deliberate choice made by gods who had fought together, freed each other, and chosen, however imperfectly, to build something cooperative in place of the fear that had defined every generation before them. Mortals below, tending their small fires and slowly building lives of their own thanks to Prometheus's quiet defiance, began to look toward that distant, cloud-wrapped peak with a particular kind of reverence. They couldn't see the halls clearly, couldn't walk those golden floors themselves, but they understood, in the way people always seem to understand such things, that something significant had settled there. A new order, finally finding its permanent shape, the long story of struggle, from chaos's first stirring to this quiet mountain now humming with the gathered presence of gods who had earned their place through war and cooperation, both had finally arrived somewhere that felt, for the first time, like it might hold. By the time this long story reaches its final stretch, so much has already changed that it becomes worth pausing, if only for a moment, to look back on how far it has traveled. There was once nothing at all, only a vast, formless quiet stretching in every direction without edges. From that emptiness came chaos, and from chaos, slowly, patiently, came shadow and night and the first pale hints of light. Gaia rose after them, broad and patient, and Uranus arched above her, and together they filled the world with children so vast the earth itself seemed to strain beneath the weight of holding them. Fear entered the story then, quiet and insidious, first in a father who pushed his children back into darkness, then in a son who swallowed his own rather than risk the same fall. Golden ages rose and ended. Wars reshaped valleys and scattered mountains across skies that had never known such violence before. Titans fell, some into darkness deeper than any that came before, one condemned to carry the very heavens on his own shoulders, and from all of that struggle, slowly, gods emerged who chose something different. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades divided a world between them not through conquest of each other but through quiet agreement. Hestia chose warmth over glory. Demeter chose the patient work of growing things. Hera built order from the ashes of every fear that came before her. Athena arrived already wise. And Apollo and Artemis brought light and wildness into careful balance. Hades ruled what no one else wanted, patiently, without complaint, and Prometheus, standing apart from every war and every throne, chose to give a small, fragile people the one gift that let them begin building lives of their own. Now, high above the mortal world, Olympus stands finished in the way a home is ever truly finished, which is to say, never completely, but settled enough to feel lasting. Halls that once existed only as an idea now hold the quiet murmur of gods moving through their days, tending gardens that never wilt, holding gatherings that stretch on unhurried, the way conversations do among people who have finally stopped fearing each other. Below, on the wide earth Gaia shaped so long ago, small fires still burn on scattered hillsides, and the people who tend them have begun to look upward with something between curiosity and reverence, sensing, in the way people always seem to sense such things, that a great story has just settled into its resting shape above them. Even if they can't yet see it clearly enough to tell it themselves, it's worth remembering, as this particular telling draws to its close, how much of this story was shaped not by triumph alone, but by quiet choices made in difficult moments. A goddess offering a stone wrapped in swaddling cloth. A god descending into darkness to free prisoners others had forgotten. A titan hiding a single ember in a hollow stalk, defying the very order he might have simply accepted instead. These are the moments that seem to matter most, looking back, more than any single battle or any single throne. The world the gods left behind, that quiet, cloud-wrapped mountain and the fire-lit hillsides beneath it, carries all of that history within it now, folded into its very shape, the way a river carries the memory of every bend it has ever taken. There is more to this story, of course. There always is. Gods who have only just settled into their halls will find new challenges arriving in time, new mortals to watch over, new balances to strike between order and wildness, between light and shadow. But those threads belong to other nights, Other tellings, waiting patiently the way Olympus itself once waited, quiet and unclaimed, for a story ready to finally arrive there. For now, let this be enough. Let the mountain stand quiet against its sky. Let the small fires below burn low and steady through the night. And let yourself, wherever you're resting tonight, drift the same slow way this story has, gently, unhurried, toward whatever rest is waiting for you. Good night.